Apollo 13 was the seventh crewed mission in the Apollo space program and the third meant to land on the Moon. The craft was launched from Kennedy Space Center on April 11, 1970, but the lunar landing was aborted after an oxygen tank in the service module failed 2 days into the mission. The crew instead looped around the Moon and returned safely to Earth on April 17. The mission was commanded by Jim Lovell, with Jack Swigert as command module pilot and Fred Hayes as lunar module pilot. Swigert was a late replacement for Ken Mattingly, who was grounded after exposure to rubella. A routine stir of an oxygen tank ignited damaged wire insulation inside it, causing an explosion that vented the contents of both of the SM's oxygen tanks to space. Without oxygen, needed for breathing and for generating electric power, the SM's propulsion and life support systems could not operate. The CM's systems had to be shut down to conserve its remaining resources for re-entry, forcing the crew to transfer to the LM as a lifeboat. With the lunar landing cancelled, mission controllers worked to bring the crew home alive. Although the LM was designed to support 2 men on the lunar surface for 2 days, Mission Control in Houston improvised new procedures so it could support 3 men for 4 days. The crew experienced great hardship, caused by limited power, a chilly and wet cabin and a shortage of potable water. There was a critical need to adapt the CM's cartridges for the carbon dioxide scrubber system to work in the LM. The crew and mission controllers were successful in improvising a solution. The astronauts' peril briefly renewed public interest in the Apollo program. Tens of millions watched the splashdown in the South Pacific Ocean on television. An investigative review board found fault with pre-flight testing of the oxygen tank and Teflon being placed inside it. The board recommended changes, including minimizing the use of potentially combustible items inside the tank. This was done for Apollo 14. The story of Apollo 13 has been dramatized several times, most notably in the 1995 film Apollo 13 based on Lost Moon, the 1994 memoir co-authored by Lovell, and an episode of the 1998 miniseries From the Earth to the Moon. 1961, U.S. President John F. Kennedy challenged his nation to land an astronaut on the Moon by the end of the decade, with a safe return to Earth. NASA worked towards this goal incrementally, sending astronauts into space during Project Mercury and Project Gemini, leading up to the Apollo program. The goal was achieved with Apollo 11, which landed on the Moon on July 20, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface while Michael Collins orbited the Moon in Command Module Columbia. The mission returned to Earth on July 24, 1969, fulfilling Kennedy's challenge. NASA had contracted for 15 Saturn V rockets to achieve the goal. At the time, no one knew how many missions this would require. Since success was obtained in 1969 with the 6th Saturn V on Apollo 11, 9 rockets remained available for a hoped-for total of 10 landings. After the excitement of Apollo 11, the general public grew apathetic towards the space program and Congress continued to cut NASA's budget. Apollo 20 was cancelled. Despite the successful lunar landing, the missions were considered so risky that astronauts could not afford life insurance to provide for their families if they died in space. Note 1. Even before the first U.S. astronaut entered space in 1961, planning for a centralized facility to communicate with the spacecraft and monitor its performance had begun, for the most part the brainchild of Christopher C. Kraft Jr., who became NASA's first flight director. During John Glenn's Mercury Friendship 7 flight in February 1962, one of Kraft's decisions was overruled by NASA managers. He was vindicated by post-mission analysis and implemented a rule that, during the mission, the flight director's word was absolute. To overrule him, NASA would have to fire him on the spot. Flight directors during Apollo had a one-sentence job description: the flight director may take any actions necessary for crew safety and mission success. In 1965, Houston's Mission Control Center opened, in part designed by Kraft and now named for him. In mission control, each flight controller, in addition to monitoring telemetry from the spacecraft, was in communication via voice loop to specialists in a staff support room, who focused on specific spacecraft systems. Apollo 13 was to be the second H mission, meant to demonstrate precision lunar landings and explore specific sites on the Moon. With Kennedy's goal accomplished by Apollo 11, and Apollo 12 demonstrating that the astronauts could perform a precision landing, mission planners were able to focus on more than just landing safely and having astronauts minimally trained in geology gather lunar samples to take home to Earth. There was a greater role for science on Apollo 13, especially for geology, something emphasized by the mission's motto, Ex Luna, Scientia. Apollo 13's mission commander, Jim Lovell, was 42 years old at the time of the spaceflight. He was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and had been a naval aviator and test pilot before being selected for the second group of astronauts in 1962. He flew with Frank Borman in Gemini 7 in 1965 and Buzz Aldrin in Gemini 12 the following year before flying in Apollo 8 in 1968, the first spacecraft to orbit the Moon. At the time of Apollo 13, Lovell was the NASA astronaut with the most time in space, with 572 hours over the 3 missions. Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, was 38 years old and held a BS in mechanical engineering and an MS in aerospace science. He had served in the Air Force and in State Air National Guards and was an engineering test pilot before being selected for the 5th group of astronauts in 1966. Fred Haise, the lunar module pilot, was 35 years old. He held a BS in aeronautical engineering, had been a Marine Corps fighter pilot, and was a civilian research pilot for NASA when he was selected as a Group 5 astronaut. According to the standard Apollo crew rotation, the prime crew for Apollo 13 would have been the backup crew, Note 2, for Apollo 10, with Mercury and Gemini veteran Gordon Cooper in command, Don F. Eisele as CMP and Edgar Mitchell as LMP. Dickie Slayton, NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations, never intended to rotate Cooper and Eisele to a prime crew assignment, as both were out of favor, Cooper for his lax attitude towards training, and Eisele for incidents aboard Apollo 7 and an extramarital affair. He assigned them to the backup crew because no other veteran astronauts were available. Slayton's original choices for Apollo 13 were Alan Shepard as commander, Stuart Roosa as CMP, and Mitchell as LMP. However, management felt Shepard needed more training time, as he had only recently resumed active status after surgery for an inner ear disorder and had not flown since 1961. Thus, Lovell's crew, having all backed up Apollo 11 and being slated for Apollo 14, was swapped with Shepard's. Swigert was originally CMP of Apollo 13's backup crew, with John Young as commander and Charles Duke as lunar module pilot. 7 days before launch, Duke contracted rubella from a friend of his son. This exposed both the prime and backup crews, who trained together. Of the 5, only Mattingly was not immune through prior exposure. Normally, if any member of the prime crew had to be grounded, the remaining crew would be replaced as well, and the backup crew substituted, but Duke's illness ruled this out, so 2 days before launch, Mattingly was replaced by Swigert. Mattingly never developed rubella and later flew on Apollo 16. For Apollo, a third crew of astronauts, known as the support crew, was designated in addition to the prime and backup crews used on projects Mercury and Gemini. Slayton created the support crews because James McDivitt, who would command Apollo 9, believed that, with preparation going on in facilities across the U.S., meetings that needed a member of the flight crew would be missed. Support crew members were to assist as directed by the mission commander. Usually low in seniority, they assembled the mission's rules, flight plan, and checklists, and kept them updated. For Apollo 13, they were Vance D. Brand, Jack Luzma and either William Pogue or Joseph Kerwin. The Apollo 13 mission insignia depicts the Greek god of the sun, Apollo, with 3 horses pulling his chariot across the face of the moon, and the Earth seen in the distance. This is meant to symbolize the Apollo flights bringing the light of knowledge to all people. In choosing it, Lovell adapted the motto of his alma mater, the Naval Academy, Ex Scientia, Tridens.